The storm erased the entire world outside the cabin and left only two strangers, a fire, and a silence that changed everything. The snow began as a fine, dry powder that hissed against the window panes like sand, but by nightfall it had turned into a heavy, suffocating white that erased the fence lines and the road and the very idea of a world beyond the cabin walls. Inside, the air smelled of seasoned cedar and the sharp, medicinal tang of the liniment Elias was rubbing into Clara's shoulder. She sat on a low wooden stool by the hearth, her back turned to him, the fabric of her chemise pulled down just far enough to reveal the angry, yellowed bruising from where the wagon had tipped 2 days prior. Elias worked in a silence so thick it possessed its own weight, his large, calloused hands moving with a precision that belied their rough appearance. He didn't speak, and neither did she. The only sounds were the rhythmic pop of the fire, the muffled roar of the wind in the chimney, and the soft, liquid slide of his palms against her skin. He was a man built of hard angles and old regrets, and she was a woman whose weariness had become a kind of permanent weather. And here, trapped in the amber light of the kerosene lamp, they were simply two bodies trying to keep the cold at bay. The lamplight flickered, casting their shadows long and distorted against the rough-hewn log walls. Elias paused to dip his fingers back into the tin of salve, the movement practiced and slow. He felt the tension in the muscles of her neck, a rigid cord of guardedness that hadn't loosened in the 3 months since they had agreed to share this claim for the sake of the winter harvest. They lived in a forced proximity that was purely practical, a marriage of necessity that lacked the heat of romance or the comfort of friendship. They were two strangers who had reached a silent accord. He would provide the strength for the heavy timber and the hunt, and she would provide the order and the hearth. But the storm had changed the geography of the room. It had shrunk their world to the radius of the fire's heat, making the distance between them, once measured in polite nods and averted gazes, impossible to maintain. Elias applied more pressure to the bruise, his thumbs tracing the line of her shoulder blade. He felt a small shudder ripple through her, and for a moment he hesitated. "Is it too much?" he asked, his voice a low, gravelly resonance that seemed to vibrate in the floorboards. "No," Clara replied, her voice barely a whisper over the crackle of the flames. "It's fine." He continued the work, his hands warmed from the friction. He noticed the way the firelight caught the fine, loose hairs at the nape of her neck, and the way her breathing was beginning to slow, moving from the shallow hitch of pain to a deeper, more rhythmic draw. He didn't think about the war he had left behind or the brother he hadn't saved. He thought only of the texture of her skin and the specific heat of the room. He was a man who had spent most of his life in motion, running from the ghosts of a dozen different towns. But here, with the snow piling up against the door, there was nowhere left to go. The stillness was a new kind of labor, one that required more of him than the axe or the plow. When he finished, he wiped his hands on a clean rag and stood up, his joints popping in the quiet. He moved to the stove to check the kettle, his boots making a soft, solid thud on the braided rug. The metal of the kettle was dull and heavy, and as he lifted it, the steam rose in a white, ghost-like plume that vanished into the rafters. He poured 2 cups of tea, the liquid dark and smelling of dried mint. He set one on the table near her and kept the other, wrapping his fingers around the warmth of the ceramic. Clara pulled her chemise back up, her movement slow and slightly stiff. She didn't look at him as she took the cup, but she didn't pull away when his hand brushed hers. She stayed on the stool, staring into the heart of the fire, where the embers were turning from bright orange to a soft, glowing red. "The wind's shifted," she said, nodding toward the chimney. "North-northwest," Elias agreed. "It'll be deep by morrow."
They sat in the silence that followed, a silence that was no longer the sharp, prickly thing it had been in the early autumn. It had become a soft, shared space, a blanket they both sat under without acknowledging it. Elias watched the way she held her cup, her fingers interlaced around the warmth. He realized he knew the rhythm of her days as well as his own, the sound of her feet on the floor in the morning, the way she hummed when she was focused on a stitch, the specific way she folded the heavy wool blankets. It was a comfort born of repetition, a slow-growing safety that had taken root in the gaps between their few spoken words. He moved to the window, cupping his hands against the glass to peer out. There was nothing but a swirling, violent white. The world had been erased. He felt a strange sense of relief in it. As long as the storm lasted, there were no fences to mend, no timber to haul, and no pass to outrun. There was only the cabin and the fire and the woman sitting by it. He turned back and saw that her head was nodding, her eyes half closed. The warmth and the tea and the release of the tension in her shoulder were pulling her toward sleep. "You should lie down, Clara," he said. "In a minute," she murmured. "The fire's nice." He didn't argue. He pulled a heavy chair closer to the hearth and sat, leaning his head back against the wood. He watched her. He wasn't observing her as a stranger anymore, but as a part of his own environment, as essential and familiar as the tools he used or the land he worked. He saw the way her hand went lax around the cup, and he reached out just as it began to tilt, taking it from her fingers and setting it on the hearthstone. She didn't wake, but she leaned toward the warmth of him, her body instinctively seeking the largest source of heat in the room. The night wore on, measured by the shrinking of the logs and the steady, rhythmic pulse of the wind. Elias didn't go to his bed in the loft. He stayed in the chair, feeding the fire every hour with a quiet, practiced efficiency. He watched the light play across Clara's face, erasing the shadows of her own tired history. She looked younger in sleep, the lines of worry around her mouth softened by the dim amber glow. He felt a sudden sharp pang of something that wasn't quite joy and wasn't quite sorrow, but a heavy, meaningful blend of both. It was the feeling of a man who had finally found a place where the air was still. By 3 a.m, the storm had reached its peak. The cabin groaned under the pressure of the wind, the heavy logs settling like a distant thunder. Clara stirred in her sleep, a small, troubled sound escaping her lips. She shifted on the stool, nearly losing her balance. Elias reached out and caught her by the waist, steadying her. She woke then, her eyes blinking open, wide and disoriented in the firelight. "Elias?" she whispered. "The wind's just high," he said. "You're all right." She didn't pull away from his touch. She looked at his hand on her waist, then up at his face. The distance between them was gone, replaced by the immediate physical reality of the dark room and the dying fire. She reached out and touched his forearm, her fingers tracing the heavy denim of his sleeve. "You stayed awake," she said. "Someone had to mind the stove." She didn't say thank you. She didn't need to. The gratitude was in the way she leaned her weight into his hand, the way she allowed herself to be held. She moved from the stool to the floor at his feet, resting her back against the chair, her head near his knee. Elias let his hand rest on her shoulder, his thumb tracing the fabric of her chemise. It was a quiet, unstudied closeness, a natural extension of the 3 months they had spent learning the architecture of each other's presence. "The snow will be over the windows by dawn," she said, her voice sounding far away. "We'll dig out, together." "Yes," she whispered, "together." The word hung in the air, simple and heavy. It wasn't a promise of forever. It was a statement of fact for the morning. They sat there as the fire burned down to a low, steady hum. The textures of the room felt heightened in the dark, the rough grain of the floorboards, the soft wool of the rug, the heat of her skin through her clothes. Elias felt a profound sense of safety, a feeling he hadn't known since he was a boy. He realized then that he didn't want the storm to end. He didn't want to open the door and find the world again. He wanted to stay in this small, warm circle, where the only thing that mattered was the breath of the woman resting against him.
As the first gray light of dawn began to seep through the top of the frosted windows, the wind finally died down to a low, mournful whistle. The cabin was silent, save for the crackle of the last log. Clara had fallen back into a deep, peaceful sleep, her head now resting fully on Elias's knee. He looked down at her, the gray light revealing the fine dust on her hair and the softness of her cheek. He didn't move to get up. He didn't think about the work that waited for him in the snow. He simply reached out and pulled a stray blanket from the back of the chair, draping it over her shoulders with a careful, silent tenderness. She stirred slightly, her hand reaching up to grasp his wrist over the blanket. She didn't wake, but she held on to him, her grip firm even in sleep. Elias leaned back and closed his eyes, his heart quiet, his mind clear. The world outside was white and frozen and indifferent, but inside, the air was warm and smelled of cedar. He stayed exactly where he was, his hand beneath hers, listening to the steady, rhythmic sound of her breathing as the sun climbed unseen behind the clouds, turning the frosted glass into a wall of shimmering silver light. He sat there in the growing day, the weight of her hand on his wrist the only anchor he needed. The fire had gone out, but the warmth remained, trapped between them in the quiet, dusty air. He didn't speak, and he didn't move to leave. He simply remained, a man who had finally stopped running, anchored to the floor by the simple, heavy truth of a woman who had chosen to stay. Clara shifted her head, her breath warm against the denim of his trousers. She let out a long, shuddering sigh of contentment, her fingers tightening just a fraction more around his wrist. Elias looked out at the white world through the sliver of glass at the top of the door and felt a peace so absolute it felt like a new kind of strength. He didn't need the horizon anymore. He had everything he needed right here, in the silence and the gray light and the weight of her hand. He leaned his head back against the chair and let out a breath he felt he had been holding for years. The room was still, the house was quiet, and for the first time in a long time, the morning didn't feel like a threat. It felt like an arrival. He stayed there, his thumb moving in a slow, rhythmic circle against the back of her hand, watching the light turn from silver to a pale, hopeful gold on the log walls.